War. War never changes.
What does it mean in the Fallout games when they say war? War never changes. I have some thoughts, and I want you to hold on to that just for a little while. We're going to explore a little bit more about what happened during the Great War, when it was, why it occurred. Where was the United States at the time? These games all focus in different locations in the United States. We don't know what the rest of the world is actually like. From gameplay experience, we know so there's some records and things, but for most cases, the people and the characters that we are playing in the game aren't able to leave the United States. So we only know about some places in the West Coast, some places on the East Coast. So let's delve into some of what actually happened at the beginning of, well, everything. According to the FalloutWikia.com article, they say, although events in the Fallout universe and the real world diverged around the mid-1940s, the defining moment of the Fallout universe was the Great War of 2077. And that date should look familiar. In a lot of the audio logs and a lot of the references that you see from the old world in these games, the dates usually lead up to about 2077. Dwindling petroleum resources led to a series of regional wars for resource control, and economies began to fold as nations were left without this vital lifeline. So that's the root of it. The world was built around these natural resources. The natural resources began to run out. Alternative sources of energy were explored, leading to the maturation of nuclear fission technology, as well as various innovation in solar and hydroelectric power, and even nuclear fusion. But none of these were sufficient to serve the global population's ever-growing needs. In the Fallout world, they decided to double down on nuclear power, and we will see that everywhere in the games. Think about it. Everything is powered by nuclear power, for the most part. So, with the available resources of crude oil in the world constantly diminishing, the communist government of the People's Republic of China declared war on the United States, invading Alaska for the few remaining sources of oil there. It is the one time, according to what we know about Fallout lore, where the United States was attacked directly on our soil. It was called the Sino-American War, and it raged for 11 years, eventually culminating in a nuclear exchange between China and the United States. It's assumed that the Chinese launched the nukes against the United States, and the United States retaliated. So conflict continued. Both nations had built up a huge stockpile of nuclear weapons, and the mutual attack drew in enemies and allies from around the world, igniting every hatred forged throughout the century-long Cold War. Although the conflict lasted only 2 hours, the destruction it brought was staggering and complete. More energy was released in the early moments of the exchange than in all previous global conflicts combined. This global nuclear conflict came to be known as the Great War. So every time you hear reference to the Great War, this is it. The bombs dropped, everybody launched their bombs, and the world was blown back to the Stone Age. The world that remained was harsh and unforgiving. 90 years after the Great War, humanity struggled to survive. On the surface, bandits and organized gangs fought over the crumbling remains of once great cities, and mutants prowled the irradiated wastes. Underground, a fortunate few enjoyed the relative safety and comfort of the vaults. Well, relative safety and comfort is, I guess, debatable, but designed before the war, and with the proclaimed purpose of protecting residents and their descendants from the nuclear annihilation. Some planned to keep the world out. Others sought to connect with and repopulate the outside. Wherever humanity survived, it was under constant threat by ravenous mutants, rogue machines, vicious raiders, and all manner of hostile mutant creatures. So in my mind, war never changes is really a commentary on humans. Humans never change. If it wasn't for humans, we wouldn't have war. If it wasn't for humans, we wouldn't have mutants and robots perpetuating the war that we've created and are are constantly involved in ever since the Great War. It's as if that war never ended, it just pit us against each other. For most of human history, according to the wiki, the Fallout universe and the real world shared a common timeline. So we have a lot of connections to this Fallout world. It is based on our world. So let's just start there. Fallout draws its music from the 1940s and 50s, and sometimes the 60s. I'll note that. Sometimes the music is actually from the 60s, and some of the technology too. However, in 1945, significant political and technological differences in the Fallout timeline set it on a different course. 1945 is the end of World War II, so that's the main divergent point. There are some events that occur before that date that lead to a divergence. There's also some fictional places and characters and organizations that come about earlier in the timeline, but the main fundamental difference is in the politics and the technology from 1945 on. So continuing, it says, in 1947, the circumstances involving the invention of the transistor are muddled, and miniaturization of electronics was neglected. So imagine a world where we don't have the miniaturization of technology. We don't have cell phones. We don't have simple very complex computers that fit in our pockets or on our desks. Everything stays big and bulky. Sometime before 1969, in an attempt to mitigate the influence of communism, the United States adopted a system of 13 commonwealths. In 1970, China failed to adopt any free market reforms and ended up retaining a political and economic structure similar to what it had under Communist Party chairman Mao Zedong. And in 1991, the USSR did not collapse. So what do we have here? We have the states of the United States consolidating, and we have communism continuing. In our own timeline, for the most part, communism is a failed experiment. The USSR ends, the Chinese go to a much more reformed economic structure where they are now competing in very capitalist type ways with the rest of the world. But in this timeline, the Cold War continues. The United States is firmly against communism like we were in the 1940s and 1950s and continue to be until the Great War happens. So according to the wiki, no major international conflicts took place until the middle of the 21st century. So there was relative peace. It was like the Cold War was going on, brewing underneath the surface, but nothing really happened until 2052. When the oil-rich Middle East nations raised oil prices, causing the economic collapse of many smaller countries. The European Commonwealth, analogous to the real-world European Union, similarly dependent on oil imports from the Middle East, began the resource wars by responding with military force. The United Nations, weakened by its inability to prevent the conflict, attempted to intervene. Many of its member nations responded by withdrawing, and the UN disbanded that year. The United States, supplied with oil from Texas and Mexico, escaped any direct impact from the resource wars. However, the US would soon have significant problems of its own. In 2052, the Texas oil fields ran dry, making the country severely vulnerable to energy shortages. And then in 2053, the new plague began to ravage the US population, causing an estimated 200,000 deaths and prompting the government to close the country's international borders. Nuclear fears gripped the country when in that same year, Tel Aviv was destroyed by a terrorist nuclear weapon, and in the following year, warring nations exchanged nuclear weapon strikes in the Middle East. Things started to heat up. That's basically what this is saying, is the United States becomes more desperate for oil. We have a plague, and then some bombs are released in the world through some sort of nuclear exchange in the Middle East. In response, the Americans began Project Safehouse, a series of underground vaults designed to survive nuclear war or an epidemic. So in comes Vault-Tec. In 2059, oil resources grew increasingly scarce. To secure the Alaskan oil fields, the United States ramped up its military presence in that state, creating the Anchorage Front Line. Relations with Canada grew increasingly strained as the Americans pressed to have their military units stationed on Canadian soil to protect the Alaskan pipeline. In 2060, the Middle Eastern oil fields ran dry, not only ending the resource wars in Europe, but the European Commonwealth as well. Without a common enemy, the European nations fought among each other for the remaining resources. Fossil fuels became too expensive to use in automobiles, and alternatives began to appear in the market. So that's why when you accidentally shoot a car in a Fallout game, it explodes. It is being powered by some sort of nuclear fusion technology, not oil. In 2066, the resource wars shifted to the other side of the globe. China, their oil reserves exhausted and their economy near collapse, invaded Alaska. So that's when it happened, 2066, just 11 years before the quote-unquote Great War. America strong-armed Canada into allowing troops and planes to move across Canadian territory on their way to the Alaskan theater. Relations between the neighboring countries continued to worsen as the Americans helped themselves to Canadian resources, ignoring Canadian protests. So America does what America does and just, pushes the smaller guy around. And many Americans begin referring to Canada as Little America, which doesn't help any of the relations. In 2072, the Sino-American War raged on. While American power armor proved effective in localized conflicts, it failed to completely dislodge Chinese forces. The Americans continued to demand more resources from Canada. And then when an attempt was made to sabotage the oil pipeline, the Americans officially began to annex Canada. In 2076, 1 year before the Great War, the annexation is complete. Also, that year, Americans deployed the T-51B power armor. That classic power armor look from all the way back in the first Fallout game? That's it right there. They deployed it to the Chinese mainland. War was on. The suits were highly effective, and American troops cut a swath through Chinese territory. So one of the things to take note here about the way the war goes on is that the Americans double down on technology and on brute force and power because we still have resources to use. So we start leveraging those resources against the communist forces, specifically China. That's where power armor comes from. Now, the Chinese didn't have the same resources that the Americans had, so they focused more on stealth technology and spying and these other kinds of indirect means of warfare. And that is true. You find it in the game. You find stealth suits made by the Chinese and those kinds of things. That's all Chinese technology. In early 2077, the Americans reclaimed Alaska, but no armistice was signed. Those in positions to foresee the nuclear conflagration make final preparations. Robert House, who you might remember from Fallout New Vegas, puts himself in stasis. The president and the Enclave retreat to the Poseidon oil rig. So all of these characters act before the bombs drop. Why is that? Why did they seem to understand that that's about to happen? Was there something that clued them in? Well, we'll just have to see. The American public, having been exposed to too many false alarms, largely ignored the warning sirens when the bombs began to fall. Many vaults are underpopulated as their doors shut. In the early hours of October 23rd, 2077, the world, as everyone knew it, ended. Missiles and bombs rained from the sky, engulfing the world in flames, in an event that would become known as the Great War. Cities and nations fell, and humanity descended into a nuclear dark age. Many believed it was the end of human civilization, but instead, it was simply the beginning of a new and bloody chapter.